freedom that drove men and women to the edge of endurance. By 1777, what had begun as a bold declaration of defiance had spiralled into a brutal struggle with no clear end in sight. In those early years, the British Empire, with its vast resources and disciplined forces, seemed unstoppable. Battle after battle, they pressed on, capturing cities, breaking spirits, and leaving the dream of independence dim and distant. For the Continental Army, survival itself felt like a victory. Under-equipped, under-trained, they were learning hard and bitter lessons on the battlefield, struggling to find unity and a sense of purpose as doubt and fear grew. Yet, even in those dark hours, something extraordinary was taking shape. The years from 1777 to 1780 were crucial. It was during this time that the army started to mature, moving beyond mere survival to a newfound strength and determination. Across the Atlantic, a shift was happening in Europe too. Nations that had watched the American cause from a distance began to see the rebellion in a new light. They saw an opportunity to challenge Britain's dominance, to level the scales of power. This wasn't just about American independence anymore. This was the beginning of an international struggle, one that would turn a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. Welcome to ASMR History. Today, in episode 4 of my 6-part series on the American Revolution, we're diving into the pivotal moments that changed everything. We'll trace the impact of events like the Saratoga campaign, the French alliance, Britain's strategic pivot to the south, and the global alliances that turned this war on its head. Our journey begins with the Battle of Saratoga, a victory that would light a spark of hope and set the stage for a revolution no one could ignore. British General John Burgoyne's plan was bold, some might say foolhardy. He envisioned a powerful stroke that would end the American Revolution in one decisive blow. By cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies, he believed he could isolate and crush the heart of the rebellion, dividing and weakening the fledgling American forces. The strategy seemed sound on paper. His troops would advance southward from Canada through the thick forests and rugged wilderness of upstate New York. They would link up with British forces moving northward from New York City, pinching the colonies in a vice that would force them into submission. Confident in the might of the British military and his own ability to lead, Burgoyne set forth with a meticulously planned campaign, sure that his army's march would be the turning point in Britain's favour. Yet, as Burgoyne's forces moved deeper into the American wilderness, the elegant simplicity of his plan began to crumble against the harsh realities of the land and the unexpected resilience of the American forces. The wild, untamed terrain of upstate New York was an enemy all its own. Towering trees stretched endlessly, their dense canopies blocking sunlight and creating a disorienting maze for British soldiers unfamiliar with the landscape. Rivers sliced through the terrain, and vast swamps lay waiting to swallow up artillery, wagons, and horses. Progress slowed to a crawl as Burgoyne's troops, burdened with heavy artillery and supplies, hacked their way American spirit. The pace was agonizingly slow, and the British soldiers soon realized that they were not only fighting Americans, but also the land itself. The grueling march was compounded by the relentless harassment of American forces, who understood the land far better than Burgoyne's men. Local militias, made up of farmers, hunters, and scouts, knew every path and stream, every hidden vantage point. They moved like ghosts, appearing seemingly out of nowhere to strike, and then vanishing back into the trees before the British could organise a counterattack. These American fighters used guerrilla tactics, ambushing British soldiers, sabotaging supply lines, and felling trees across the narrow forest paths to block Burgoyne's advance. It was a strategy of attrition, aimed at wearing down the British soldiers' bodies and spirits as they trudged forward, foot by painful foot. The wilderness itself became a weapon in the hands of the Americans. The dense undergrowth and twisted paths offered perfect cover for militia attacks, allowing them to bleed Burgoyne's forces dry without ever engaging in open battle. American scouts observed every British movement, waiting patiently for vulnerable moments to strike. Ambushes were swift and brutal, striking fear and frustration into Burgoyne's men, who soon found themselves facing not only visible enemies, but an omnipresent, invisible force lurking in the shadows. Supplies began to dwindle as the supply lines became stretched and vulnerable to American raids. Food ran low and ammunition grew scarce. Each mile gained required a staggering cost in time, resources, and morale, and every skirmish reminded Burgoyne's troops that their enemy had no intention of fighting by the rules of traditional warfare. For Burgoyne's men, who had entered the campaign with optimism and confidence, the constant attacks, the grueling pace, and the endless wilderness began to sap their spirits. Every tree, every bend in the road became a potential danger, a place where American fighters might be waiting. Exhaustion took its toll as they hacked through the forest day after day, and fear became a constant companion. Burgoyne's well-crafted strategy was unravelling, not because of any great battle, but through the relentless strain of marching, fighting, and surviving in a land that seemed to conspire against them. By the time they reached the battlefield at Saratoga, Burgoyne's army was battered, depleted, and demoralised, far from the formidable force he had envisioned leading to victory. September 19, 1777, marked the first major clash at Freeman's Farm, a pivotal battle that would signal the beginning of the end for General Burgoyne's ambitious campaign. The American forces, under the command of Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, knew they were outnumbered and outgunned by the British regulars. A direct assault would be disastrous, but they understood that they had one powerful advantage. They knew the land and could move with agility through the woods and hills surrounding the farm. Rather than engage in traditional line warfare, they chose a strategy of guerrilla-style skirmishes, harassing the British with quick, fierce strikes, and then melting back into the trees. It was a style of combat that bewildered the British, who were accustomed to orderly battles on open fields, and it played perfectly to the American strengths. At the forefront of the American assault were Daniel Morgan's American sharpshooters, a unit of expert marksmen renowned for their deadly accuracy. Armed with long rifles that allowed them to target from afar, Morgan's men had one mission: to disrupt the British ranks by picking off officers and key personnel. One by one, British leaders fell, creating gaps in command that confused and disoriented the troops. The precision of Morgan's sharpshooters struck fear into the British ranks, breaking down their morale and sowing chaos as soldiers watched their officers fall. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, ever fierce and driven, pushed his men into relentless attacks, urging them forward with a mix of bravado and charisma. His energy on the battlefield was contagious. Even as the British held their ground, they faced a relentless onslaught from the Americans, who fought with a passion and determination that belied their smaller numbers. By the end of the day, the British technically held the field, but the cost of their victory was staggering. The casualty count was far higher than Burgoyne had expected, with many of his finest soldiers dead or wounded. Freeman's Farm was less a victory and more a harbinger of the difficulties that lay ahead. The British forces, now depleted and shaken, were left to ponder the toll of fighting an enemy willing to use every trick, every piece of ground, and every ounce of courage to wear them down. Morale among Burgoyne's men began to erode, and the realities of their isolated position in hostile territory grew more ominous. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, the two armies clashed again in the Battle of Bemis Heights, a confrontation that would seal Burgoyne's fate. By now, the American forces had dug in and fortified their positions with the help of Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a Polish military engineer whose strategic mind transformed the battlefield. Kosciuszko had directed the construction of defensive lines that took advantage of the high ground, creating a layered defence that forced the British to advance uphill and across rough terrain. The ridges and natural barriers around Bemis Heights became impenetrable fortresses, with American forces well protected behind earthworks, trees, and ridgelines that Kosciuszko had reinforced. As the British advanced, they were forced to fight uphill against a well-entrenched enemy, turning the battlefield into a brutal uphill slog where every inch cost them dearly. Amidst this fierce battle, Benedict Arnold, who had been relieved of his command due to disputes with his superiors, could not stand idly by. Driven by a fierce desire to see the British defeated, Arnold defied orders and charged headlong into the fray. Ignoring the formalities of rank and command, he threw himself into the thick of the fighting, rallying American troops who were inspired by his audacity. Arnold's boldness was contagious, and his presence on the battlefield reinvigorated the American forces. With a mixture of raw courage and tactical brilliance, he led a charge that broke through the British lines, creating a breach that sent shockwaves through Burgoyne's troops. British soldiers, already worn down by Freeman's Farm and the grueling march that preceded it, faltered in the face of Arnold's unrelenting assault. The Americans seized on the opportunity, pressing forward with renewed vigour. As Arnold's men surged into the British defences, the tide of the battle decisively turned. Burgoyne's forces, battered and exhausted, could no Surrounded by American forces and cut off from reinforcements, Burgoyne saw no way out. On October 17th, 1777, he surrendered his entire force to the American General Horatio Gates in a moment that would resonate throughout the colonies. Burgoyne's surrender was a powerful symbol. As he presented his sword to Gates, it was more than just the end of a campaign. It was the first major sign that the American cause could indeed succeed. Across the colonies, the news sparked celebrations, reviving spirits and renewing hope. This victory showed Americans that even the mighty British army could be defeated, sparking a surge of confidence that would fuel the war effort for years to come. The impact of Saratoga reached far beyond the battlefields of New York. This victory became a beacon, a signal to the world that the American cause was not a lost one. European powers, particularly France, had watched the struggle with interest, but had been hesitant to support what seemed like an uphill and possibly hopeless fight. Saratoga changed everything. Here was proof that the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with the British and emerge victorious. It was enough to convince France that an alliance with the American colonies was not only viable but essential. This triumph set the stage for a diplomatic breakthrough that would reshape the Revolutionary War, drawing France into the conflict and turning a local rebellion into a truly international war. In the candlelit salons and gilded halls of Paris, one of history's most pivotal alliances was being forged. French nobility gathered beneath opulent chandeliers and frescoed ceilings, their whispers and curious glances trailing Benjamin Franklin, the unlikely diplomat who had captured their imaginations. Franklin, with his modest attire and unpowdered hair, stood in stark contrast to the elaborate dress and courtly manners of the French elite. Yet his simplicity was a refreshing novelty, lending him an air of authenticity that Parisian society found irresistible. Franklin understood that to secure French support for the American cause, he needed to do more than simply present his case. He needed to charm, intrigue, and inspire. His intelligence and warmth, wrapped in a persona that seemed both rustic and wise, turned him into a sensation, a symbol of the rugged individualism and pioneering spirit that defined the American struggle for freedom. Parisian society buzzed with excitement over this strange, charismatic man from across the ocean, a man who brought tales of a people fighting for liberty against a powerful empire. Franklin's presence became magnetic. He moved through salons with ease, capturing the admiration of writers, philosophers, and the French nobility alike. To many, he embodied the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, progress, and the belief that individuals had the right to shape their own destinies. French intellectuals saw in Franklin's America a daring experiment, a chance to test the very principles they had long debated. Soon he became the darling of Paris, celebrated at gatherings and dinners, even inspiring a fashion for Franklin-style spectacles and fur caps. Franklin was no longer just a diplomat. He was a symbol, a living testament to the audacity and ideals that had captivated the world. Yet, for all the admiration Franklin received, Winning the support of King Louis XVI and his advisors was no easy task. The king, a cautious ruler by nature, saw both promise and peril in the American cause. Aiding a colonial rebellion against Britain, France's long-time adversary, was tempting but fraught with risk. Supporting the Americans could provoke British retaliation, potentially drawing France into a costly war across the Atlantic. The king's advisors too were wary. They understood that such a move would entail significant financial and military commitment at a time when France's own resources were stretched thin. The stakes were immense, and for Louis, the decision hinged on a delicate balance of ambition and caution. Standing in Franklin's corner, however, was the shrewd Comte de Vergennes, France's foreign minister and a master strategist. Vergennes had studied Britain's global ambitions closely and saw an opportunity in America's fight for independence. He understood that by backing the Americans, France could strike at Britain in a way that would weaken his empire without directly engaging in European warfare. Vergennes saw beyond the immediate risks. He envisioned a broader strategy, one in which an American victory would tilt the balance of power, eroding Britain's influence and positioning France as the benefactor of a new republic across the ocean. He also knew that the alliance needed to be presented to the king not merely as an act of charity, but as a calculated move that could bring prestige, influence, and economic opportunities back to France. Months passed as Vergennes worked tirelessly behind the scenes, framing the American cause as more than a distant rebellion. It was France's golden chance to tip the scales against Britain. His persuasion was subtle but powerful, carefully guiding the French court toward the idea of a formal alliance. Franklin, meanwhile, continued to work his charm, meeting with French officials and society figures, reinforcing the idea that the American struggle for freedom was not only just, but inevitable. Every diplomatic success, every gathering in which Franklin inspired talk of liberty and resilience, pushed the court closer to the tipping point. Finally, in 1778, after months of negotiation, France made its move. King Louis XVI, swayed by Vergennes' strategy and Franklin's relentless diplomacy, formally committed to an alliance with the American colonies. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance were signed, binding France to the American cause in a powerful pact that would change the course of the war. France's commitment was no small gesture. It meant financial support, military aid, and most crucially, the presence of the French Navy, which would later prove instrumental in the victory at Yorktown. The American cause, once seen as a tenuous rebellion, now had the backing of one of the most formidable powers in the world. For the Americans, the French alliance was a lifeline, a promise that they would not have to face the British Empire alone. French support brought not only resources, but hope, a sense that the fight for independence was truly within reach. The alliance breathed new life into the American Revolution, turning it from a colonial struggle into a global conflict. The formal backing of France emboldened the Americans, giving them the means to stand firm European soil and positioned them as champions of a new era of self-determination and freedom. By aligning with America, France took its place on the world stage as an advocate for liberty, even as it sowed the seeds of revolutionary fervour within its own borders. The French alliance, forged in the glittering salons of Paris and sealed by the determination of Franklin and Vergennes, would become one of the most consequential partnerships in history, shaping the fate of two nations and altering the global balance of power. With the stroke of a pen, France had become the essential partner America had desperately needed. The French contributions were sweeping, from bolstering naval power to infusing critical supplies into American ranks. One of the most significant contributions came from the formidable French Navy, which would soon disrupt British control of the seas. The French fleet, now a vital arm of the American war effort, began to target British supply routes with strategic precision. With British ships facing new threats on multiple fronts, the strain on their supply lines grew. This newfound naval support breathed life into the Continental Army, bringing much needed food, ammunition, and other supplies that allowed Washington's forces to survive in some of the war's most trying moments. But the alliance was more than ships and supplies. It was also the expertise and leadership of French officers like General Rochambeau, who arrived to lend both skill and discipline to the American forces. Rochambeau and his officers coordinated closely with Washington, providing not just tactical support, but a much-needed boost to the Continental Army's organisation and morale. French officers brought European military training to the battlefield, drilling American soldiers, raising their confidence and sharpening their effectiveness. The sight of French soldiers fighting alongside Americans on the front lines became a powerful symbol of international support, instilling hope that victory was possible. France's support extended to financial aid, a lifeline that sustained the Continental Army through harsh winters and countless resource shortages. The French treasury funneled funds into the American war chest, providing everything from muskets to uniforms. For the Continental soldiers, who often endured winters with worn-out clothes and scant food, these supplies were a godsend. Beyond material support, French funding enabled American forces to survive through financial droughts that might otherwise have spelled disaster. The war effort was no longer a matter of American endurance alone. It was a shared struggle backed by France's resources and commitment. France's entry into the war forced Britain into a radical re-evaluation of its strategy. Now, the British had to stretch their resources across a global battlefield, defending not only their interests in America, but also their vast empire overseas. French forces targeted British holdings in the Caribbean, challenging Britain's dominance in lucrative colonies that were the crown jewels of its empire. British soldiers, who once focused solely on crushing the Continental Army, now had to contend with a multi-front war, juggling the defence of Caribbean plantations and European territory with the battle for American lands. This shifting focus meant that British forces in America lost reinforcements, facing prolonged campaigns with dwindling numbers and resources. By 1778, Britain was ready to shift its strategy in the American Revolutionary War. After years of grueling battles in the north, British commanders turned their attention southward, betting on a different approach to secure victory. The southern colonies, they believed, would be fertile ground for loyalist support. Wealthy plantations, powerful loyalist families, and a general sense of order had led British strategists to assume that the South would welcome their return with open arms. With a strong base of loyalists, they hoped to stabilise Georgia and the Carolinas, reclaiming them as British strongholds from which they could gradually work their way north. General Charles Cornwallis was the man assigned to bring this vision to life, leading a campaign that would both reclaim lost ground and establish a new centre of British control. Cornwallis's orders were clear: regain control over the southern territories, establish secure supply lines, and rally loyalists to join the British cause. Initially, the plan seemed sound. Savannah fell with little resistance, and British forces quickly moved into South Carolina, capturing Charleston in a decisive victory. But what the British hadn't anticipated was the strength and ferocity of the local resistance they would soon face. For the British Army, the campaign would quickly devolve into a frustrating and unpredictable struggle, plagued by ambushes, logistical nightmares, and a ruthless, invisible enemy lurking in the swamps and forests. In the dense forests of the Carolinas, the British met an unconventional but unyielding opponent: the local militias. Unlike the structured, disciplined Continental Army, these militias were unpredictable and deeply entrenched in the southern landscape. Leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, orchestrated daring guerrilla campaigns, exploiting their knowledge of the terrain to hit the British where it hurt most. Marion's men moved swiftly and silently, striking supply lines and ambushing isolated British troops before vanishing back into the swamps. These militias embraced the guerrilla warfare tactics that kept the British forces constantly on edge, unsure when or where the next blow might fall. Cornwallis and his men found themselves caught in a shadow war, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The relentless harassment of British forces became a nightmare. Supplies were crucial, yet every shipment was at risk. British convoys were ambushed along narrow, twisting roads. Critical supplies were raided or destroyed. Even the night offered little reprieve. Militia forces launched surprise attacks under the cover of darkness, rattling British camps and sapping their morale. For Cornwallis, the task of securing the South turned from a logistical campaign to a psychological battle. Every day brought new losses, new frustrations, and a growing sense of isolation. British soldiers, unfamiliar with the swampy terrain, felt like strangers in a hostile land, where every shadow hid a threat, every path was a potential trap. This guerrilla warfare had another, more insidious impact. It forced the British to adopt increasingly harsh measures in an attempt to stamp out resistance. British troops began burning homes and farms suspected of aiding the Patriots, punishing local populations in hopes of cutting off the militia's support. But rather than pacifying the countryside. These brutal tactics only turned more colonists against them. Many who had once remained neutral or even leaned loyalist began to see the British as invaders rather than protectors. Instead of rallying support, British actions fueled resentment, driving more Southerners into the arms of the Patriot cause and swelling the ranks of the militias. The South was not a unified bastion of loyalist support that Britain had hoped to find. It was a patchwork of conflicting loyalties, with fierce divisions between patriots and loyalists that created a civil war atmosphere. Neighbours turned against neighbours, with skirmishes breaking out in towns and villages as local militias clashed with loyalist forces. In this chaotic environment, the British found themselves caught in the crossfire of deeply personal conflicts that had been brewing for years. Cornwallis's forces, instead of being welcomed by loyalist allies, often found themselves caught between hostile patriots and embittered loyalists who expected British protection but received little in return. These complexities revealed just how flawed Britain's southern strategy truly was. Cornwallis and his commanders had failed to grasp the intricate social and political dynamics of the South. They had assumed that loyalist support would be waiting for them, but the reality was far messier. The Patriot resolve was deeply entrenched, and loyalist support proved fractured and unreliable. Instead of finding allies, the British faced hostility, resistance, and a region fraught with tensions that they struggled to navigate. In many ways, their campaign to win the hearts and minds of the southern colonies only served to ignite deeper hatred and resentment, with Cornwallis's campaign increasingly mired in guerrilla warfare, hostile locals, and strategic missteps. The stage was set for the British to face an even greater series of challenges in key battles that would test their endurance and shape the outcome of the war. In the coming years, from brutal clashes to decisive victories, the southern theatre would become the crucible in which both sides would press their final bids for dominance. In the blistering summer heat of June 1778, the Continental and British armies faced off in what would become one of the most grueling engagements of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Monmouth. The day began under a relentless sun, with temperatures soaring so high that soldiers on both sides collapsed from heat exhaustion, some never to rise again. Men and horses struggled against the oppressive warmth, and the very air felt heavy with the weight of battle. As the Continental Army advanced, General George Washington rode alongside his men, eyes sharp with determination. When the moment came to hold their ground against a British counterattack, Washington's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Stand fast, my boys." It was a rallying cry that would reverberate through the ranks and echo down the corridors of history. The Battle of Monmouth was the first major engagement after the winter at Valley Forge, where the Continental Army had undergone a rigorous transformation under the watchful eye of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer brought in to drill the troops. Von Steuben's training paid off that day. The soldiers fought with a discipline and tactical skill they had never shown before, standing shoulder to shoulder and manoeuvring with precision. precision, even as heat and exhaustion took their toll. Although the battle itself ended in a draw, with neither side claiming decisive victory, it marked a turning point in the war. The Continental Army, once seen as little more than a band of rebellious farmers, had proven it could stand toe-to-toe with the might of the British Empire. Monmouth wasn't just a battlefield, it was a proving ground for Washington's forces, instilling confidence that would fuel their resolve through the long war still to come. While Monmouth showcased the strength of the American spirit, the British quickly recalibrated their approach, setting their sights on a strategic target in the south. In 1780, they launched a full-scale siege on Charleston, South Carolina, a key port city and symbolic stronghold in the colonies. The siege was meticulously planned, with British General Sir Henry Clinton leading a coordinated assault to choke off the city's defences and cut off any hope of reinforcement. British forces established their positions, closing in on Charleston inch by inch, tightening their grip as supplies dwindled and hope began to fade within the American ranks. After weeks of relentless bombardment and isolation, the defenders had little choice but to surrender. Over 5,000 American troops laid down their arms in what would be the largest single loss for the Continental Army during the war. The fall of Charleston sent shockwaves through the colonies. It was a devastating blow, one that temporarily shifted the momentum in Britain's favour and gave a boost to British morale. The capture of Charleston wasn't just a victory on paper, it represented a moment of triumph that echoed across the Atlantic, reigniting British confidence. Yet, the victory came at a high cost, sparking a brutal aftermath as loyalist and patriot forces clashed throughout the Carolinas. As British forces attempted to solidify their control, tensions boiled over into violent skirmishes, creating an atmosphere of civil war in the southern colonies. Neighbours became enemies, and the once idyllic countryside was torn apart by reprisals and counter-reprisals, as each side fought not only for territory, but for survival. Charleston may have fallen, but the fight for the South was far from over. Not long after the loss of Charleston, another painful defeat struck the American forces. At the Battle of Camden in August 1780, American General Horatio Gates, hailed as the hero of Saratoga, led his forces against the British in hopes of reclaiming lost ground in the south. But Camden would prove to be a disastrous miscalculation. Gates's troops, many of whom were untrained militia, faced off against British regulars under General Cornwallis. It was a mismatch from the start. The American forces faltered under the weight of the British advance, and as panic spread, the lines broke, sending the Continental soldiers into a chaotic retreat. Camden was not only a significant military loss, but a severe blow to American morale. The dream of quickly regaining the South had been shattered, leaving the Patriots to reconsider their strategy and rebuild their confidence after such a devastating setback. Yet, the Americans in the South were far from defeated. While formal armies clashed in major battles, the dense woods and winding rivers of the Carolinas became the stage for a different kind of warfare, one led by fighters like Francis Marion, famously known as the Swamp Fox, utilised guerrilla tactics to wage a relentless campaign against British forces. Marion's men moved quickly and struck hard, ambushing British patrols, sabotaging supply lines, and disappearing into the wilderness before the British could organise a response. These tactics turned the southern campaign into a constant thorn in the British side. Unlike open field battles, this guerrilla warfare was unpredictable, wearing down the British forces bit by bit and gradually shifting control back to the Patriots. These smaller skirmishes and relentless harassment laid the groundwork for a resurgence in Patriot control throughout the South. Each raid, ambush, and disruption weakened the British hold, proving that American resistance was resilient and adaptable. By the end of 1780, the Southern campaign had turned into a brutal struggle of endurance and resourcefulness. As the conflict intensified, international support became more critical than ever, with the French and other allies stepping up their efforts to assist the American cause in ways that would reshape the global balance of power. As the American Revolutionary War raged on, it became increasingly clear that this conflict was no longer confined to the battlefields of North America. By 1779, the war had expanded into a global struggle, with European powers stepping forward, each with their own reasons to challenge Britain's supremacy. Spain, a close ally of France, entered the fray with ambitions of its own. Spanish leaders saw the war as an opportunity to reclaim territories lost to Britain, including the valuable outpost of Gibraltar. With its prime location on the Mediterranean, Gibraltar represented both a strategic and symbolic prize. Spanish forces, under the direction of Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Spanish Louisiana, launched a series of successful campaigns against British holdings along the Gulf Coast, capturing forts in Florida and opening up crucial supply lines for the American cause. Spain's involvement added new pressure on Britain's overstretched resources, further complicating its efforts to maintain control over its far-flung empire. Meanwhile, the Netherlands offered invaluable support, particularly in the form of financial aid. Though officially neutral for much of the conflict, the Dutch sympathised with the American quest for independence and had long-standing commercial interests that often clashed with Britain's ambitions. Dutch bankers extended significant loans to the Americans, financing essential supplies, arms, and other resources that allowed the Continental Army to continue fighting through the toughest moments of the war. This financial backing, combined with indirect aid in the form of trade and supplies, provided a critical lifeline that kept the American war effort afloat. When Britain finally declared war on the Netherlands in 1780, it sparked yet another front in the global theatre, turning a colonial rebellion into a world-spanning conflict that forced Britain to confront enemies on every side. The entry of these new powers placed an immense strain on Britain's military and economic resources, already grappling with the challenges of fighting on unfamiliar terrain in North America. British commanders now had to defend key territories in the Caribbean, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Each new battlefront drained resources from troops to ships to supplies, and the British government found itself under intense pressure to finance a war that had spiralled far beyond its initial scope. The logistical challenge of sustaining a multi-front conflict was staggering. British ships, once rulers of the seas, now faced blockades and skirmishes that hampered their ability to maintain open supply lines to North America. Every shipment of food, ammunition, or reinforcements came at an escalating cost, with ships forced to dodge enemy fleets and privateers that patrolled the waters, ready to intercept. The financial toll on Britain was devastating. The costs of the war rose with each passing year, leading to massive debts and an economic downturn that stirred unrest at home. As the British government funneled more resources into the war, it faced the rising costs of supplies, mercenary contracts, and the salaries of troops stationed around the globe. The toll wasn't just economic. Morale among British forces began to wane as soldiers stationed far from home grappled with the hardships of a seemingly endless conflict. The British people too grew weary of the war's demands. With news of battles lost and taxes increased, public support for the conflict began to erode, creating a political crisis that made the situation even more untenable for Britain. As the war expanded, battles erupted across continents, spreading from the Caribbean to the coastlines of Africa and even to the Indian subcontinent. In the Caribbean, the British fought to protect their valuable sugar islands from the Spanish and French, leading to fierce naval clashes and bloody skirmishes. Each of these engagements pulled more British forces away from North America, weakening Britain's ability to concentrate on the American theatre. In Africa, colonial outposts and trade routes became battlegrounds as European powers sought to disrupt Britain's influence and reduce its profits from the lucrative slave and goods trades. Even in India, where Britain had established a stronghold, rival colonial powers sought to seize the moment and challenge British authority, further stretching British forces and splitting their focus. The result of this global engagement was a profound weakening of Britain's position in North America. The forces that remained in the American colonies were left to fend for themselves with dwindling resources and limited reinforcements. Loyalist support waned as even the most committed colonists began to doubt Britain's ability to protect them. With each passing month, British commanders struggled to maintain order and control in a land that grew more hostile and less forgiving. Britain's military might, once so fearsome, was now spread thin across the world's oceans and battlefields. As international support for the American cause intensified, the dream of independence no longer seemed like a distant hope. France, Spain, and the Netherlands had not only bolstered America's resources, but had turned the conflict into an empire-spanning war that drained Britain's strength and resolve. With these powerful allies at their side, the Americans were ready to make their final push for freedom. As the Revolutionary War drew to its dramatic and decisive conclusion, the American Revolution was a war of unexpected twists, marked by pivotal moments that transformed a fledgling rebellion into a fight for freedom proved that the Americans could defeat British forces and set the stage for the formal alliance with France, which changed the war's scope entirely. From that point on, the conflict was no longer a colonial skirmish, but a clash of global powers, with France's support and, later, the involvement of Spain and the Netherlands bolstering the American cause. In response, Britain adjusted its strategy, focusing on the south, where they hoped to rally loyalists and secure a stronghold. But here too, the Americans showed their resilience. Battles like Monmouth and the tragic fall of Charleston displayed the highs and lows of the conflict, as did smaller skirmishes and the guerrilla tactics of militia leaders like Francis Marion. With each clash, the Americans proved they would not surrender their cause. By 1780, Britain was fighting a war on multiple fronts, drained by the cost of defending a global empire. Meanwhile, the Patriots grew stronger, armed with international support, steely determination, and a dream of independence that would not be denied. As the Revolutionary War neared its final chapter, hope burned brightly for the Americans. The combined strength of the Continental Army and its allies signalled that Britain's hold on the colonies was slipping, that a new era was on the horizon. The tides were turning, and the Americans sensed victory within reach. In our next episode, we will journey to the south once more, where decisive battles would soon unfold, culminating in the Battle of Yorktown. This final showdown would seal the fate of the war, securing American independence and forever altering the course of history.